Welcome to Malvern Books, in Malvern's Multiverse. This is a little event that we have once a month where I chat with people from around Austin and talk about, poetry and, things that, go on and make up our world. And I'm very, very excited tonight to talk to Liliana Valenzuela about translation. And I look at my audience, and you guys know about translation. I don't. I published a lot of translation, so I hope my questions are not too basic for you guys, but then there'll be a Q&A afterwards where you guys can chat with Liliana yourself. And we'll see how that goes and stuff like that. But let me just go ahead and introduce Liliana. Liliana Valenzuela's bilingual poetry chapbook, Codex of Journeys, Bendito, Camino, was published by Mouthfeel Press in 2012, and we're lucky enough to have a few copies for sale. Liliana is an acclaimed Spanish language translator of works by Sandra Cisneros, Alvarez, Denise Chávez, Marie Martínez, Castillo, Richard Rodríguez, Rudolfo, on and on. These people, I'm probably butchering their names, and many other writers. Her translation of Sandra Cisneros, A House of My Own, was published in 2016. A member of the Macondo Writers Workshop and inaugural fellow of the CantoMundo, she works for Ahora Sí, the Spanish weekly of Austin American-Statesman. Welcome, Liliana. Thank you so much for coming in and talking with me.
Yeah, my pleasure, and thank you all for being here.
So, as I said, this is, I treat this as a basic, what is translation all about type of thing. And so, I wanted to start with just the basic question that I have. And I always had, when I was publishing translations, because I would wonder what the translator would think. Should a translation really faithfully capture the original text or make something new and distinctive of its own? And if both, in which case?
Yeah, I think that it's like finding a happy medium between the two, like trying to translate as much as you can of the original text and the particular voice of the author and the stylistic resources and devices that the author is using, and reproducing that same effect in the translation. And at the same time, you have to have a little bit of freedom to create something new that's going to work in the target language, and that will be a work of literature on its own, regardless of the original.
Right.
Yeah, so you can take a few liberties.
Yeah, but it's been looked upon, and I learned, again, as I'll say, I published a lot of translation. I learned that the translator is, has been overlooked in the past, and I think that the translator needs to be looked upon as an artist themselves. And I started putting translators' names on the covers and things like that. So, because you're really bringing something to the reader in what you do.
Right, yeah, and I think there's been, different metaphors to talk about translation and what it is that we do and how we do it. And one of it is like being a performer that's performing a work that's like a piece of music, and you're performing it in a different language, and so you have to bring some of your own sensibility and music and interpretation into the work. So it becomes something different than if somebody else interprets that same piece of music it's going to sound a little bit different because they're going to bring a different sensibility, a different frame of reference. So there could be as many good translations of any one text, depending on the particular translator.
Right.
And yeah, before it used to be more like you were invisible, you were in the background, and the work almost translated itself and appeared magically. And now we are acknowledging that yeah, it does make a big difference who translates a particular work and when.
Yes.
And like you can have retranslations of a different work, and they're all going to be pretty different depending on what kind of language is being used at the time.
Right. I always look at when I read translation, is I look at at the translator as my first reader, as the first reader of the text who's giving it to me, and things like that. And I really appreciate that because I don't read other languages, but so I'm glad people do translate and things like that.
Yeah, I think a translator is like the closest reader possibly that a text is ever going to have.
Yeah, but and it's like you said, every translator brings their own something to it as well. Now, is the goal of the translation to get the atmosphere of the story, the author's style, has been preserved to the full, or do you just take what you can get, or do you, is it, or do you just, are there some texts that you just leave aside, or, what do you feel like there?
Yeah, when I first read a work that I'm going to translate, I try to get a feeling for what is this? What am I experiencing here? And kind of take some notes as I go along as to the initial reaction that I get, and how to characterize the particular style, and if there's some passages that are more difficult or have specialized vocabulary, make note of that, and then kind of read it in a different way than if I would read it just for pleasure.
Right.
Or just reading it for the story.
Yeah.
When you read any other book. But if I'm going to translate it, I'm reading it at the level of the language.
I see.
And noticing different things. And so when I get ready to translate it, I try to reproduce or interpret those things that I make note of in the translation, so that my goal is that the reader of the translation has the same aesthetic, emotional, intellectual experience as the reader of the original work, as much as possible.
Right.
And of course, it's not perfect, it's not between a science and an art, and it's like somewhere in between.
Yeah.
And some authors, you're able to do that more than with others, that they just stir something in you, or you just feel like an affinity, and others maybe not so much. So it varies.
I see. So when I think of translating, so much of what I think of is almost, and it's my lack of knowledge of language again, is I think word by word by word, almost. And of course you don't do it that way, but do you think of the overall structure of a piece when you're translating, as well as the in the way it lends itself to the meaning, as well as the just the linguistic coming across in communication?
Yeah, I think it is. Obviously it's not word for word, because then it just wouldn't make sense, and it would be like too cardboardy, and it wouldn't make sense in the target language. It would sound like it was translated or artificial. And so, you can think of translating all the different words, but then sometimes you have to completely turn it around and find what is the right syntax in the target language.
Right.
And so that means totally inverting and switching things around. And if you left them just as they were, it would be really awkward.
Yeah.
And so one thing is the syntax, the other one would be the vocabulary, and like from all the different choices of words that you have, which ones are you going to use for each particular word or pair of words.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes those choices are determined by your ear.
Okay.
And like what you perceive the style of the author to be, and then how would that best sound in the target language. Or what kind of person one of the characters is.
Right.
And you have to ask yourself, like, who is this person, and how would they speak? And what kind of register would they use? Is it someone who's like, out in the streets and joking around with his buddies, and how would that person speak to his buddies? Or is this a person who uses only very high register language and very refined language? And so you kind of have to tune your ear for each character and try to make them speak as naturally as possible in the target language, which is not always easy, but it's also fun because it's like being a ventriloquist of sorts.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned, you suggested a couple of questions. One of the things that really struck me as interesting is that, when you're translating into different regional dialects, like if you're translating into different kinds of Spanish, say into Spanish from Mexico or from the Dominican Republic or something like that, what are the challenges there?
Right, like in my case, I translate from English into Spanish, and you could say that there is one generic kind of Spanish that is used for non-literary materials like a brochure or a pamphlet or employee manual, or like technical kinds of translations that you translate into more standard kind of Spanish. But if you're translating a literary text, I think in most cases there is the need to tailor it and make it more specialized for whatever the text calls for, as opposed to doing a generic Spanish. And I think my reaction came for adopting that technique or style is growing up reading translations from Spanish from Spain.
Yeah.
Books translated into Spanish, Spanish, and it always sounded so artificial and so horrible to me. I would be like, it just sounded like someone from Spain. It didn't matter what book it was, they all sounded the same.
Okay.
And so I thought when I started translating, I was like, of course I'm not going to do that, first because I'm not Spaniard and I don't speak that way. And also because the particular books of Sandra Cisneros that I started translating at first were very specifically Mexican, using Mexican Spanish. And the author also wanted me to use as much Mexican Spanish as possible and gave me free rein to do that. And so that was like a fun exercise for me to try to reproduce the different kinds of Spanish from, let's say, Mexico City, the Spanish mixed with English that's spoken in Texas, or the English with some Spanish that the mom of this character would speak in Chicago, and then mixed in with other words from the Nahuatl, from Mexican Spanish, there's also Nahuatl words, and then the register of English, like very proper English, King William English, and also like street English, translated into Spanish. And then when I had the opportunity to translate works by Julia Alvarez, who's from the Dominican Republic, and I thought, well, I'm not from there either. I don't know exactly how to do it, but I'm willing to come as close as I can to that. And also the author wanted it to be a Dominican translation.
Okay.
And so I ended up working with an informant who was living here in Austin, and he was a man who was almost the same age as her, so he would also have the same historical references.
Okay.
Going back to, as far as that. And so I would have a list of questions, and I would ask him, like, what would you say for this word? What would you say for that word? And he also went through the text, and he would tell me, like, no, like, big garbage can is not basurero, it's a zafacón. And I think that actually came from the French.
Safety can.
Or safety can.
Puerto Rico too.
Yeah. Oh, zafacón. Yeah. Yeah, so words like that. And also, like, for the books that the girl would take to school, I was using something like mochila. And he was like, no, that's not what we would use at the time, because it was like in the 50s. We would have used, I think he said, an atado, which was just like a belt that they would kind of tie the books with and just kind of carry them like that.
Okay, yeah.
And just little details like that you have to, if you don't know, you have to ask.
Yeah.
You have to ask someone who's best informed.
Right.
And who can help you refine the text.
Well, no, that's great. Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. And to be so careful. Now, I know that you were a poet as well, right? And so I have down here is, but how different is translating? Let's just start with general poetry, and then we'll move to yours. How different is it translating poetry than it is translating prose work?
It's quite different.
Okay.
I think the difference is, in general terms, is prose. Of course, there's a lot more words.
Yeah.
And a lot more, longer sentences and ideas and characters, dialogue. But it's also more conversational, descriptive, and so it's kind of like a different flow. You kind of get into a flow of the story and crafting things as paragraphs and moving the story along and the transitions. And with poetry, the language is very concentrated and dense, and of course there's fewer words, but the combination of the words in the original have like different possibilities, different meanings that can kind of spark each other off. And so when you do a translation, you have all the different choices for each word, and depending on what you choose, it's going to create different fireworks, if you will, in the translated work. So I think poetry is much more laborious, time-intensive, and you can spend hours on a single poem. I mean, not to say that sometimes fiction, there's sections where you can also end up spending a lot of time trying to figure something out, but it's just a very different process and method.
So, with your own poetry, do you feel more comfortable moving from Spanish to English or English to Spanish?
I feel more comfortable going from English into Spanish, which is my native tongue, than from Spanish into English. And some people ask, like, why? why aren't you able to just go back and forth or do both? My answer to that is, at this point, I have lived more than half my life in the United States, so my English, I think, has gotten pretty good to the point where I can write directly a poem in English.
Okay.
But when I write a poem in Spanish, and then to try to bring it into English is very difficult because I'm very close to the Latinate roots and sounds, and it's very hard to kind of change hats and put my Anglo-Saxon hat and try to come up with those sounds and those combinations. It's hard. It's hard.
I can only imagine. But,
So other people have helped me and translated my work
oh, great.
into English.
So I thought now we would open it up to some questions from our distinguished audience. Does anybody, have questions, want to discuss anything with Liliana? Please. Yes.
Have you got a list of 2 or 3 dozen books that you think must be translated into English?
Not right of hand. But I think there are a lot of Latin American writers that would be great to have available in English. And a lot of Caribbean writers, and Cuba, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and then on to all of Latin America. And it's rare that they get a chance to be translated into English, because I think, I forget what the percentage was, but I think, what is one of the publishing houses that
3%.
3%, but that's into English.
Yeah.
Yes. But no, the publishing house in Dallas that is
Deep
Vellum,
Yeah.
and I think they had a statistic too of, there's such few Mexican works, for instance, that get translated into English. It's like tiny percentage. So there's so much more out there that could be translated that is not, and the books that make it across are few and far between.
Yes. What about internal translation? Let's say you have an expatriate novel written in English and it's taking place in Oaxaca, say, and they're sitting around a cafe table and there's some Spanish speakers and some English speakers, and some Spanish expressions are used within the English text. Do you think those should be translated, or just left to the reader to his own devices?
It depends. It depends on the author and the text and kind of the flavor of the work and what would make sense. There would have to be a rationale for deciding one way or the other. My tendency would be to leave some of the language, the other language, for it to be a hybrid text, if the original was hybrid, mixing the 2 languages. And it may not be in that exact same place, but it could be in a different place that you can insert it so that it would seem more natural. It doesn't have to be like an exact mirror image, but just so that there's some of that sprinkled throughout the text to convey to the reader that, oh, these people are originally from the US, but they're living out in Mexico, and they're used to mixing the languages. And if it was like some obscure reference or something that English speakers might not readily know, there's ways where you can weave in like a mini explanation within the text without having to use a footnote. Like some authors or some translators like adding footnotes, but I tend to just kind of weave it
In the text.
so it's unobtrusive. So it's a little bit that you're adding that wasn't there, but it helps the reader kind of fill in the blanks.
Could you tell us a little bit about your relationships with the authors you've translated, Cisneros, Alvarez, and so on, and whether you've translated only living authors or dead authors as well? And how different is that?
Well, I think I have mostly translated live authors, and so I've always had some kind of correspondence or interaction, whether in person, via email, phone call, and that's because I've translated mostly contemporary Latino, Chicano writers into Spanish, and some Anglo too. So I don't know, I don't think, what it would be like to in the other case, but for most of the authors that I've translated, I've had good luck that I've had some good working relationships, and where together we can come up with a better solution than just me by myself or the author by themselves. And some also don't want to participate at all. They're just like, oh yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, whatever you want. Whatever. And others are very involved, like in the case of Sandra Cisneros, because she does have working knowledge, pretty good knowledge of Spanish, and she's very interested in it being faithful. We do have a lot of conversations, and she does have opinions about the sound and the word choice, and so it's very much a collaborative relationship. We're just going back and forth, bouncing things around until we come up with the best solution. So that's been very fun. And yeah, I guess in other cases, I won't mention names, but someone who didn't trust me very much and was always like second guessing me, and then it can be difficult too. And because they're entrusting their baby to you, and if they think maybe they know the language, but they don't know it as well as they perhaps should or think they do, that can be problematic.
Yes, my Spanish is very middling, but far from perfect. But I will sometimes be reading, say, a poem in Spanish, and I'll look at, say, the facing page translation. That's not the way I would have translated it. I wonder if, as a professional translator, you have the experience of, let's say, how many translations into English have there been of Don Quixote? Let's say you're reading Edith Grossman and say, that's not the way I would do it. Do you feel challenged to go ahead and retranslate something that's already been done maybe several times?
Yeah, of course they're all very different, and sometimes, that's the advantage and disadvantage of having them face to face, because it's very tempting to read it and compare it and not really see the translation for its own merit. And especially in poetry, sometimes it departs quite a bit from the original, because you have to recreate it and come up with something new that maybe is pretty different from the original. And like in the case of some of the older translations of there's also been so many translations of Neruda poems that after a certain time they start to feel dated. And so when you read it, it's like, no, that's not how I would do it, or that's not kind of the street language or the current slang. And so that could prompt me to say, no, that's not how I hear it, and I'll probably do something different.
Oh, sorry.
Well, I was just going to ask you, do you get to go down to Spanish-speaking countries and kind of recharge?
Yes, yeah.
When I do go down, every time it's different.
Right. Yeah, and I'm lucky that I still have family and friends in Mexico, and so I go every year, and I'm always have my radar out to how people are speaking, and for new words, new terms, or things in the paper or on TV, and young people, because of course they reinvent the language all the time. And after a while, we can start sounding dated too with some of the terms that we use, like for the word cool, you know, what do you use for cool? There's so many different ways you could say it. And depending on what you choose, you could start sounding like, oh, that was like a long time ago.
Is La Onda still cool?
Like for that, for instance, I don't think they use that. I think that in Mexico they use chido.
Chilo,
Padre.
okay.
Oh, padre,
I
yeah.
mean,
Que
depending on
padre,
the
yeah.
area.
Right, depending. And before, when I was growing up, chido was kind of more like, oh, like,
Like
you
the-
know, yeah, like vulgar. And now young people have taken it up, and words like way, that when I was growing up, only guys used the word way, and girls would never use that. And now girls call
Like
each
dude
other
in
way.
Hey,
Yeah, like guy or dude.
Dude.
Kind of like dude. And now I think girls in English also call each
Yes,
other
yeah, women
dude,
use dude. with each
right?
other.
And before it was just
Yeah.
a guy.
Yeah.
So I mean, you have to be like really keep up. And ask. If you don't know, it's like, you know, ask your friends' kids. What are they using for this?
Does anyone say, ay caramba anymore? You know, that's 50 years
Yeah,
dated at least, isn't it?
no, I think that's one of the old faithful ones.
Family questions. I'm sorry, somebody in back had a question.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes. My question was regarding the word choice. Like when you mentioned the word choice, I have a lot of trouble when I'm trying to sound like me but in English. Then I should take the word and exactly the same meaning as in English, or should be more the way I'm using the word in the context and find that word. You know what I mean?
No, like, can you think like an example?
Like if I should use the word that is exactly the translation,
Mhm.
or the word that it works in the context of the text.
Yeah, I think the second.
That it might not be exactly the translation as in the dictionary, but it is closer to the meaning of what I'm saying, or
Yeah, I would go with the meaning,
with the meaning, like
the general
the
meaning.
context.
The
rather
context,
than
yeah.
the dictionary.
Yeah, because otherwise,
Yes,
if you
because-
just go the exact word, sometimes
Yes.
to us, it would sound natural, but then to a native English speaker, it might sound really stilted, or like, no, that's not how we say things.
Exactly. Like my husband was crazy about it. Like, what are you trying to say? But,
Yeah, and you kind of have to find your own voice in English,
Uh-huh.
and with trial and error, and see, yeah, how do you sound, or how do you want to sound, especially for a written voice,
Yes.
and what your style is going to be, like how formal or how casual, and you just have to keep trying and keep working on it, because
Yes.
it takes a while, yeah.
Thank you.
I remember reading an American novel in English set in Mexico, and he keeps using the expression of now and when. You know, a literal translation of de vez en cuando.
Oops.
This doesn't work very well.
So I had a question, because I think I heard you say that you, and I think
Of
we
time.
may have had this conversation, that you read the word first before you translate it.
Yes.
So I wanted to hear more about that, why you do that, why you do it that way, and if you've ever tried some other way.
Yeah, I know. I think we've had that conversation, and I know, like, Gregory Rabasa used to just translate cold
Jumps right in.
and jump right in and start translating, and you attempted that
Yeah, I do it all the
style
time, yeah.
too.
That's what I do.
For me, I just couldn't.
Yeah.
Like, if it were maybe like a short story,
Yeah.
is one thing, and that would be like a fun experiment to try. But I think for a novel,
Yeah.
I need to kind of first get a sense for the whole and really absorb the language and the cadence, the rhythm, and see what I feel about the work in its entirety, and do that analysis that I was telling Joe about, and just make note of all those different things, fresh, or just from the first impression. And I don't think I would want to just do it
Just jump right in.
line by line without knowing what's next, or what the plot is, or how it ends.
Right. So if I may follow up on that, does it happen to you that when you read it that first time, in your head you're already translating it, and you're afraid that you might lose that, and do you take notes from that as well? Because you're saying about taking notes about the structure and about things that you notice, but do you ever take any notes about what's already going inside your head, or you see something, you go, oh, this is definitely X. I have to make sure that I do X over here. Does that happen during that first reading?
Well, I think the only time it happens is when translating Sandra Cisneros' work, where she herself is translating a Spanish phrase into English. And it sounds kind of funny and interesting in English because it comes from the Spanish, and when I read it, I think, oh, I know exactly where she got that from and how this sounds in Spanish. But then when I was ready to start translating, I could still hear it in my head, so I wasn't afraid that I would lose it or not find it again. Yeah, but if that method works for you, that's good.
When you've translated a section or the whole thing, but you're still too close to it, so close to it that you read it and you wonder, you ask yourself, do we say it that way? Or have I just carried over the cadence or something from the source language? Do you have a method for a sort of a palate cleanser that helps you kind of wipe clean and come back and go through it as objectively as you can?
Yeah, I think when you first translate something and you're still too close, just like waiting overnight sometimes helps. And just doing the 4 passes that our friend Marian taught me how to do, of just doing the first translation, a draft translation, and not worrying too much about polishing it just then, and then having like list of queries for the author, and then now that we can look things up in the internet so quickly, now we can just answer a lot of those, or queries to friends and colleagues. And then the second pass, I compare line by line the original and the translation to make sure I didn't miss anything, add anything, and so it happens, because sometimes you're like so focused on solving one particular thing that then is like, oh, I forgot that adjective, or oh, there's a whole line that's missing. And so I just go with the index card the old way and just comparing and methodically going through the whole thing. Then I put away the original and just read it for flow in the target language and just see how it sounds, and if it sounds like the author, that I think that's how the author sounds. And that involves changing the syntax too, because sometimes the syntax is too close to the original and it's like, no, this doesn't work in Spanish, and so you kind of have to turn it around and kind of redo it and change the punctuation, because that changes too. And then the 4th pass is for just proofreading and just seeing if you missed any little things or any typos or anything that you might have missed. And so I think the time that passes in between all those stages is plenty of beauty rest everywhere that, that you call it easy to spot. Oftentimes you just go like, oh no, yeah, this doesn't work, I need to change it this way. Or sometimes you go like, no, that was right, that was my first instinct was right. And so that's a method that has worked very well for me, so thank you, Marian.
Sometimes do you read out loud?
Yeah, sometimes, but not like an entire novel. Maybe you do, but like if there's a problematic paragraph or difficult paragraph, because I've had like really convoluted paragraphs that are just like a series of sentences that are just so complex that to make sure I got it, I will read it several times and just see. Yeah, and your ear often tells you how you should change things and where the punctuation should go.
I would imagine before you start in on a project, you get the approval of the author or publisher. For example, if you just started in translating of something of Sandra Cisneros, well, Elena Poniatowska's already done that.
Right.
How do you
Yeah,
go
in
about
my
that?
case, I do.
Okay.
I do, and I always have had the permission, the agreement, but I know I've been privileged in that regard, and not all translators have that initial approval, and sometimes they have to do things on spec, meaning they like a work, they love it, they start translating it for fun, and then they try to figure out like, well, can I do this for pay, or are the rights available, and who do I contact, and where is the author, and where is the publishing house, and try to kind of backtrack and figure out all the legal aspect of it and get permission to translate. And luckily, I haven't had to go that route.
It's not a good idea.
Because you should be very
Possibly
disappointed.
illegal, too.
Yeah.
It's possibly illegal.
Yeah, I mean, like you could translate it just and have it at home and read it to yourself, but if you mean to do anything with it, such as publishing it in a magazine or journal or a book, you have to have the permission of the author and the publishing house,
Yeah,
of the original, the owner of the rights.
Yeah, I had so many people when I was publishing who translated large works, and they'd come to me as the publisher and expect me to get the rights. And I'm like, no. You have to have some communication, some, either that or we work it together before you even start.
Yeah, because that can be a lot of work.
It's a lot, and impossible. Sometimes it's impossible.
Yeah. You have to be a private detective almost.
Yes.
I
So,
think technically it may be illegal to even just translate it. I mean, who's going to know?
Yeah.
But I think technically, strictly by the law, you can't even translate without permission.
Really? Wow.
I think in, the strict legal sense.
Yeah.
But that's not really.
And except for works that are in the public domain,
yeah.
which are now, what, 125 years? Or?
No. Although I think there's.
Lifetime plus
Did you read
70
that
years,
article?
I think.
There's a change there.
From 70?
From s-
What was the Mickey
to
Mouse?
90 yeah, it's all Mickey Mouse. It's all
The Mickey Mouse case.
It's all
Seriously.
because of Mickey Mouse.
Yeah.
Disney changed that, and so I don't know what the
75
most
years
recent.
from the author's death, I think. Something like that, but I think I just read that, like this week, that they're changing it to 95 from the date of publication, which means that it's gonna be horrendous, like so many people are not gonna get published
Yeah.
because the rights won't be available.
Oh, yes, because, as I always said, dealing with an author, they love to get their work translated into English and things like that. Deal with an error.
Oh, no.
They think it's all worth millions of dollars.
And he's like, I'm just trying to help you.
Yeah, I'm just,
To get
the authors
distribution.
are just like, yes, yes, my work's in the United States, yes. But here's one. So, well, any more questions? This has been a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much, Liliana.
Thank you so
Please eat the snacks and shop if you want. I know you all know the store well.